How you doing? My name is Kevin McGonigal. I'm with DDS Match Mid-Atlantic. Today I'm here with my partner and brother, Joe McGonigal, also with DDS Match. It's January 2024, and in the spirit of New Year's resolutions, this year we're going to try to provide a little bit more content and support to practice owners who have questions. Every day we hear a wide variety of questions, and we could spend hours here going through them. But what we thought was we would try to break them down into bite-sized questions, and we'll kind of attack those topics as they come up. And today, something I've been hearing more and more about is how to effectively communicate with staff and also when to start that process. I've been a little bit surprised about what I found in my research. Often I'm finding advice to start that conversation pretty early in the process. So, Joe, I know you have a lot of experience here. I wanted to kind of get your take on what you've seen, maybe some best practices, and maybe even, a story that's gone horribly wrong. I also wanted to ask, in the spirit of being brothers, if we had to go up against the Kelsey brothers, how do you think we would do?
Well, listen, it's our first episode, so we have a long way to go to catch the Kelsey brothers, but I'm optimistic.
I just meant with
Um,
regard to selling dental practices. Who would do better, us or the Kelsey
oh,
brothers?
us for sure. There's no
All
question.
right, that's good. Good start.
I, um, this is a good topic. It's one that comes up obviously in every transition. Doctors obviously care deeply about their staff, and they're trying to figure out who the right buyer is, when to actually go through their transition, the economics of the situation. Then obviously, always at the forefront is, what about my staff? Are they going to be taken care of? I want them to be taken care of. I think the common or general recommendation is to not tell the staff too early. It's interesting that you've done some research that is counter to that. I think most advisors in the transition space would advise, waiting until close to the end to tell the staff. And I think, if I think about it, there's probably, why do we do that? When do we actually tell staff? And then probably most importantly is how, like, how do we communicate the message? So why we wait is, listen, no matter when you tell them, there's going to be anxiety, nervousness, fear, trepidation about their job security, what their day-to-day is going to look like with a new owner. So there's just all this uncertainty around it. And, if you start that process before you actually have a buyer or a timeline or a date of a transaction, you're just, fueling this uncertainty with all these questions. And so you do run the risk of people just deciding, hey, before that happens, I might want to go find another opportunity. I don't know if my job's secure. I don't know when this is going to happen. And what people generally like is security.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, and I
so
think, yeah, one of the buzzwords there too, from a buyer perspective, I think is continuity, right? Like that is high on the list of things that buyers want. And I think maybe one of the traps that people fall into, especially if you're looking at, a DSO or a buyer of that sort, is that the myth that nothing is going to change. Obviously, some things are going to change. And maybe the thought,
namely the owner of the practice. And by
yeah,
default, that means there's going to be change,
yes,
right? Yeah. No, I think so. If you think about it, like, what do you really want your staff to hear from you? If you start the process with or telling them with no buyer, no timeline, you've created this uncertainty. They're going to have a million questions, which you likely can't answer,
right.
right? So hitting them with this and then not being able to answer material questions, I don't think necessarily helps, you know, the staff process through this. Versus when you tell them when you have identified a buyer, the details of the sale are largely negotiated and potentially finalized, and you have a timeline, and you can actually introduce the next person. They've been prepped to know what kind of questions they're going to get: compensation, PTO, hours of the practice, the day to day. And so, you're telling them they know there's change, but they also know exactly kind of what that change potentially looks like, or who will be taking over. So I like it for, I like communicating this with staff. For me, after the APA or the asset purchase agreement has been fully negotiated and executed, that's the binding document.
Right.
So at that point, the transaction, both parties are largely, if not entirely, bound to the transaction. So if that staff communication goes wrong a little bit, or a staff member does decide they're going to leave, you limit the ability for the buyer to potentially back out at that stage. and coupled with that is if you let the buyer or staff know too early, you do as the seller lose some leverage. So if you let a potential buyer in before the asset purchase has been negotiated or signed and something does go wrong at that point, the buyer is free to walk. You now might have staff members who are walking, and you also lose some leverage in keeping the legal process going with the APA and the employment agreements and things like that. So I like it because I want to tell my team when there's a lot of certainty about what's happening and when it's happening. I also, from a seller representative standpoint, I like to have some leverage through the legal process to make sure we get these documents done, because that's the hurdle that has to be reached before I allow a buyer to come in and meet the staff.
One other
So I
oh, sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to say maybe one other thing on this topic is, do you often advise for a practice owner to at least have one key person in the practice, in case there are reports that need to be pulled or other information that is kind of brought up through the negotiation and sale process?
I think that's doctor dependent. I think it's deal dependent. So if you're an owner that, is pretty good at pulling reports and grabbing data, and a lot of the answers about the insurances you participate with and where those fee schedules are and things like that, you probably don't, and you're doing a private doctor to doctor sale, you probably don't have to pull in a staff member. If you're a doctor who doesn't really know how to get into your practice management software or answer a lot of questions, you might have to, because we're going to go through a due diligence process. So finding one key member, an office manager, explaining the confidential nature of this and looping them in could be productive. If you're selling to a DSO, it's very likely that you would want to pull someone in, because the due diligence and paper chasing is just ramped up to a completely different level and can, quite frankly, be pretty overwhelming for a doctor to try to gather and also be clinical and running the practice. And so from a sanity standpoint and an expediency standpoint, I think it's helpful to potentially pull in a key team member if you're selling to a strategic buyer and have more diligence to get through.
Got it. Any last minute tips or anything on maybe the language skills or something?
Yeah, so I think, so why we do it, we talked about confidentiality, having some certainty, when to do it. I believe that we do that once the APA has been signed. Now that can be, a little bit before closing. It might be at closing. I like to have the APA signed a week or two ahead of closing. Now you have a week or two while you're still the owner to have this conversation with team, let them know what's happening, versus closing, telling them right after closing, hey, I sold the practice, here's the new owner. So we work with clients about what's going to work best for your situation and how to do that. Now, how to talk about it, Kev, I think the whole thing is a communication effort. So if you get to this point and you say to your team, well, I sold the practice, here's the new doc, hopefully everything will be great. I'll be here for 3 months and then I'm out of here. That's one way to do it. Probably not the most effective, but I think it's, for these doctors that have worked with these teams for 5, 10, 15 years, what I would do is say, listen, we all knew that at some point this practice was going to transition. I'm 65, I'm 68, I'm 70. So the fact that this is happening isn't really a surprise. I understand. I empathize that the timing of this, is not probably what some of you expected. So I think communication skills is empathize with them. Sure. Like, it's hard for everybody. It's hard for you to decide to sell the practice. It's hard for you to communicate this. It's hard, for everybody. So I can empathize and sympathize the fact that this is, probably a little shocking, but here's what I can tell you, and one of the key things I wanted to make sure was that you were protected through this process. And so I did a couple things. I really went through a professional process to, talk to a number of potential buyers and strongly vetting those candidates. I'm really lucky, and I think you're really lucky. I found a great successor for the practice, not a buyer, I found a great successor for the practice. And I think you and the patients are going to be in tremendous hands. I'm here to help facilitate this transition. So I'm going to, work with Dr. Smith or Jones to work through this process. I've been able to give them background on each of you and how valuable you are to the practice. So, you hear what I'm saying to the staff is you're critical. I thought about you. I've communicated to the buyer how important you and certainly you're all going to have questions. You're going to have questions about compensation, about benefits, about personal time off. And, Dr. Smith is going to sit with each of you individually to kind of go through that. But it's something we've discussed at length. He or she knows exactly what your compensation is, what your benefits are. And our goal here is, while there will be change, the change is, gradual and not too, jarring or, immediate or, something like that. But I think that's the messaging is, put yourself in their shoes. What do they want to hear? You thought about them. You were very careful in who you selected to buy the practice, and you believe that that person understands how valuable, you are to the practice.
All right, I think that's all pretty good advice. And you can reach out to us anytime if you have questions about your practice, about where to start, how to start. That's really what we're here for, is to help you transition on your terms and find out what options are available for your practice. So again, I'm Kevin McGonigal from DDS Match. My much shorter brother, Joe McGonigal, also from DDS Match. And hopefully the Kelsey brothers are watching today, and they see us in the rearview mirror coming up.
Sounds good. We'll be back next time with another topic.
All right, see you later.